Exposure is the technical interpretation of our creative vision, translating artistic intent into measurable light levels that our camera can capture. Let me say it again. Exposure is the technical interpretation of our creative vision, translating artistic intent into measurable light level that our camera can capture. It is not a one-size-fits-all formula, but is unique to the sensor and recording format of each camera. As directors of photography, our responsibility is to understand the exposure requirements of the tools we use to ensure we capture the best possible data. While exposure is undoubtedly an art form, it is also a science, requiring us to interpret light in a way that aligns with both creative intent and technical constraint. Today, I'll go over exposure and my process to capture the best possible data, and most importantly, achieve the look that I want. The goal of exposure is not to capture your final vision, but to capture the best possible data that allows for creative flexibility in post-production. There is a crucial distinction between the raw data recorded by the camera and the final look of the image. By exposing correctly, we ensure that we retain enough information in the highlights, midtones, and shadows to manipulate the image later, whether through color grading, contrast adjustment, or stylistic choices. The key is to preserve as much dynamic range and details as possible, giving us the freedom to shape the final image into our intended artistic vision. For example, when filming a dark scene, it's critical to capture enough details in the shadows to limit noise and retain flexibility in post-production. If you ensure proper separation between the shadows and the midtones, you can later lower the shadows in post-production without introducing unwanted noises or losing detail. However, if you expose too dark in camera, you risk crushing the blacks and permanently losing valuable information, making it impossible to recover details. This is why capturing the right data up front is essential. It gives you the ability to refine and shape the final image without compromising quality. Your camera's sensor has a unique ability to record a range of brightness level, also known as dynamic range, essentially how many shades of gray it can distinguish between pure black and pure white. This range is measured in stops and used the 18% gray or middle gray as the baseline reference. Each camera sensor has a unique number of stops it can quote-unquote see above and below middle gray, determining how much detail it can retain in both highlights and shadows. Understanding this range is crucial because it tells you how much room you have before highlights clip and shadows crush into black. Camera manufacturers utilize dynamic range differently, often tailoring how it's distributed between highlights and shadows based on the settings you choose. Sony, for example, shifts its dynamic range when using different EI or exposure index values, allowing cinematographers to prioritize either more stops in the shadows or more stops in the highlights. This flexibility gives greater control over exposure, particularly in high contrast scenes, where protecting highlights or retaining shadow details is critical. If you want to dive deeper into how this works, I encourage you to check out my video on negative ISO, where I break down how adjusting your EI setting can help you maximize your camera's dynamic range. The link is in the description. Each recording format has unique exposure requirements that must be understood to maximize image quality. For example, when recording in Rec. 709, which is the standard color space and gamma curve used for HD TV and broadcast, pure white measures at 100% IRE, and pure black at 0% IRE. However, when recording in S-Log 3, a log gamma curve designed for higher dynamic range, pure white sits around 61% IRE, and pure black starts at approximately 3.5 IRE. This means that if you expose S-Log 3 using the same levels as Rec. 709, your image will be severely overexposed, causing highlights to clip and blacks to crush, ultimately losing valuable image details. As cinematographers, it is critical to understand the specific exposure requirements of the format we use so that we can properly expose our sensor and retain as much dynamic range as possible. Now that we understand our equipment exposure requirement, we can use a variety of tools and techniques to properly expose our shots. No matter which method you choose, it's essential to measure your exposure to ensure accuracy. There are two main approaches to exposing a shot: using IRE to measure brightness level, or using stops, which is the preferred methods of feature film cinematographer. Let me show you how I use IRE to expose my shots, but I'll create a future video on exposing using stops. When using IRE, there are several tools available, many of which are built directly into the camera, such as the waveform monitor, the histogram, or zebras, all of which provide a real-time feedback on brightness distribution. If you're not familiar with how to read scopes, I highly recommend checking out my video on how to read them, which is linked in the description. When exposing, I prefer to use false color as it provides a clear visualization of the different brightness ranges on the entire image. When filming in any kind of log format, it can be sometimes difficult to see the different separation levels between highlights, midtones, and shadows, since log format compresses the dynamic range. So I find it more effective to monitor my exposure using the Rec. 709 LUT output on my monitor. Now I'm still recording in S-Log3 in my case, but I apply the Rec. 709 LUT to the output to the monitor. It just makes it easier to see all the levels. Now let me be clear, when you're doing this, you're still exposing at the S-Log3 level, not the Rec. 709. You're simply using the LUT to see the exposure at a more accurate level. So for example, if I expose this white card looking at the Rec. 709 LUT and I expose it to close to 100% IRE, when I look at the S-Log file, it would show a very different level. Now, depending on the situation, I will adjust my camera settings to expose for a specific part of the image. If there's a light source in the frame that I cannot control, like a window for example, I will always expose for the uncontrollable elements first. This means adjusting my camera settings to ensure that the window does not clip the highlights, keeping it under 100% IRE. Once the uncontrollable light is properly exposed, I will not adjust my camera setting again. Instead, I will shape the rest of the scene by adding artificial light or removing any lights as needed to achieve the look that I want. So let's look at some examples. And in this shot right here, we have a couple of different problems. We have a window that I do not control. I don't have equipment to deal with that window. The only thing that plays in my favor is those trees, right? If the trees weren't there and we're looking straight at the sky, then it's a different shot. But in this case, the trees are helping me. The other challenge is the fact that he's wearing a pure white shirt. And so now I need to be careful that my exposure levels are not clipping his shirt so that we can still see details like the little wrinkles, the buttons, the difference between that side of the shirt and this side of the shirt, right? So we still see the seam here. Those are important for us to retain so it looks normal and natural. And so we don't want to overexpose that shirt. And so if I show you the false color, then we can see that what I did here is actually exposed for the shirt. So I want to bring the level on his shirt as high as I can without clipping. And so you can see that we're somewhere in the 90% IRE, which is perfect. It's not at 100% where it's pure white. We're still retaining all those details. And then it just happened that the window fell at this level, which is somewhere between, 60 and 75 IRE. And so that just worked out in my favor. What we do control is the brightness level on his face. And so we can simply put a key light on the window side to make it look natural and raise the intensity until we see the right level on his face. And for a Caucasian person, skin tone shouldn't exceed 70 IRE, so like 68 IRE. And again, that's on the Rec. 709 curve. And so because I'm monitoring Rec. 709, I want to see his skin tone to be right at that 65 to 70 IRE, no more than that. And so that's what we did. We just raised that intensity. The other thing that we can control now is the wall behind him and the computer monitors. And if you look at the computer monitors, they're very dark. And that's by design, right? We lowered the intensity of his monitor to the levels that we want, somewhere in the 20 to 15 IRE. And then on the back, we can just add any lights that we want to kind of shape that background the way we need to. And so I don't know that I did much here. Let me go back to the actual picture. We may have put a small little light hitting this frame to kind of bring it out a little bit more. So there might be a small little light that we set to the side here just for that. Now let me show you another example, maybe this time where we have full control. So in this image, I just shot this in my living room. We have full control, and now I can decide what I want this this picture to look like. And so I have to make decisions on the exposure. And I have a lamp back here in the corner that I can control. And I'm gonna adjust the intensity of that light to get to the levels that I'm interested in. So something that's not super bright, not out of place, but still provides the brightest point in the picture outside of what the light is going to do on the object. I wanted to create those very bright little spot on that particular object. And so I just raised the intensity of the light back there to the level that I want, looking at my false color. And then once I have it to the level that I want, then I can put my subject, my object in position where I want it to be. And then I'm going to adjust the intensity of my light in order to achieve that particular look. And so again, looking at the false color, and a lot of times you can control your light using an app, for example. So you can be close to your monitor, control the app, continue to adjust the intensity of that light, see the levels being raised on your false color monitor, and just dial it in where you want it to be, making sure nothing is clipped. And that's that. And if you wanted to, like we have a very dark area back here, if we wanted to retain more details there, then I could have added a small light behind the object shining towards that shadow space, and just, again, adjusting that light in order to make sure that our levels where we wanted it. So that's when you control everything. A lot of times I actually don't have full control of a space. I work a lot in corporate films, and so I shoot in offices or in people's homes, for example, and there's always some element that's not controllable. So let me show you this example. This is a quick little video. You can see that we have those two lamps, and I just wanted to use the track and go around that first lamp here. But we don't control them, right? They're, unless I go in and change the light bulbs and whatever, which we can do. But a lot of times, you go from office to office, and you're just not, you're not going to do that unless it's really a necessity. But most of the time, I can deal with those uncontrollable just fine without having to change anything. So in this case, what we did, if I show you the false color, is same thing. We are going to expose for those two lamps first. And so using my false color, I'm going to adjust my camera settings so that they're just right at peaking. And you can actually see they're at 100%. So those light bulbs are actually blown out, which is totally fine because there's nothing in those details of that particular lamp. It's not like I want to see the filament of the light bulb. And so I think in that case, it's perfectly fine. I think it's more the light that it projects on the wall that we don't want to be peaking, because then we would lose the detail of the texture of that wall if it was over 100% IRE. But so we adjusted the camera settings to be right on the edge here. And then the rest we control. So I can put a light on the side here pointing towards her face and continue to raise the intensity of that light until I see that on my false color, we reach that 65 to 70 IRE. Let me show you an example where we had full control. In this particular interview, we shot it inside of a little library, and there was no window, so we had full control of the space. This shot is for the same project as the cowboy hat that you saw, and so we wanted to maintain very deep ratios. We wanted his key side and his fill side to be very different, very deep contrast to maintain continuity between the shots. And so we started by exposing the background, and we put a light, and you can kind of see the intensity of it here and here. There's probably something here a little bit, and we just change our camera settings and our lighting back there to raise those shadow levels to the bare minimum to make sure there was no noise. And in S-Log3, I don't feel good below 15 or even 20 IRE. And so we just exposed for those shadows at 15 IRE, for example, in S-Log3. If we're monitoring Rec. 709, I would go to like a 3 or a 4 on the dark spots, maybe 5 IRE on the dark side. And if we look at our background, we can see that we exposed it. Now, again, this is the final grade, not the raw shot, but it's somewhere in that 5 IRE. So my guess is that we expose that at about 15 IRE, and then in post-production, we're able to lower those shadows down to the 5, making this pure black back here. And then we can adjust our lighting, our key light, to make sure that we get that 70 IRE on his face. And you can see that the color on his shirt is still below 100% IRE, so we still have details in texture on that fabric. This example is actually a backlit scene. So we shot this early in the morning, and the sun is, in the sky somewhere over here, but out of frame. And it's providing some levels, and that's what you see here, right? It's providing all those levels. But we wanted to see the texture in the sky. So you can see here the shadow versus this bright spot. And so that was important to maintain. And so same thing, we just changed our camera settings to make sure that the sky was not blown out. And now you can see the difference in levels between those areas. And we're clipping a little bit on the edge of the plant, of the flower. And that's because the sun's coming through. And that's okay, I'm okay with that. And we just then put a light really close to the flower. Because it's such a tight shot, we're able to bring a lamp really close. And then just continue to raise the levels until we have the brightness that we want in those details. Now, I could have done more. I could have put a bigger light there to get even more levels, but I think it would have started becoming or looking unnatural. Like the leaves are already looking like they're artificially lit. And so I don't think I would have want to push more. And at the end of the day, again, we have pretty good separation between our highlights and the midtones. And so in post-production, we can adjust those a little bit so that those can be raised here and here without compromising those very bright spots. Let's look at this interview here. So in this particular setting, we don't have control of those windows. And there's actually a lot of windows on this side as well. And so when you deal with windows, there's two things you can do. You either exposed so that you don't clip the highlights so that you can see out the window, or you blow the windows out. And that will depend on what's out there. So if it's a beautiful city view or a beautiful garden back there or something that you want to see, then you would change your camera settings so that this window would not be blown out. In our case, it was not a particularly beautiful day, and there's no great view out of those windows. And so it looked better to completely blow out those windows here and here and just leave them pure white. And then we can work the inside of the room and adjust the lighting to then get to the right level. So we do our camera setting to blow out the window. And then because of large windows here, we actually put a negative. We actually put a black material so that we would have some shadows here compared to his key side. And then we have our key light somewhere here, bringing levels on his face. And then we have a backlight creating levels on his shoulders. And same thing, once we have the levels that we want on the windows, we don't adjust our camera settings. We just adjust lighting to then again reach the levels that we want on his face and on the rest of the scene. If we need to, I don't believe we had any additional lighting on the background, but if you feel like you need to do something back there, then you can simply add lights to different areas. So like, for example, this plant, we could have put a little light here to just bring that green to be a little bit more popping if we felt like that was needed. But from an exposure standpoint, expose those windows to what you want. In our case, blown out, and then work the lighting and the negative to then get to the levels that we need. At the end of the day, exposure is not just a technical process, it's an essential part of the art of cinematography. The more you understand your camera, your recording format, and your tools, the more control you'll have over crafting the images that you envision. So keep practicing, keep experimenting, and most importantly, measure your exposure. Thank you for watching this video until the end. And if you're interested in learning more about my online cinematography course, visit the link in the description below. Thanks again, and happy filming.